Good morning. Oh, is this on? Yeah. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin today's seminar, there are a couple of routine announcements that I need to make. I'm Faridun Faizalahi of ARB. For those present in the Sierra hearing room, a couple of announcements. First, a safety announcement. In case of an emergency that requires us to evacuate this room and building, please exit the room immediately. Please look around now and identify two exits closest to you. Please take your valuables with you and do not use the elevators. Evacuees will exit down the stairways, which are to your right as you exit the room through the rear entrance. Evacuees will then proceed to Cesar Chavez Park across the street. If you cannot use stairs, you will be directed to a protective vestibule inside a stairwell. Should we have to relocate out of the building, please obey all traffic signals and exercise caution crossing the street. Second, the drinking fountain and restrooms are located out the doors at the back of the room. Go to the left, then left past the glass sculptures hanging from the ceiling. There on the right. I've done several of these. Every time it's a little different. Well, following the presentation, there will be time for questions. For those watching the presentation on the webcast, you may email your questions to the address SIERRARM, that's SIERRARM, at calepa.ca.gov. And now here's the chairman himself to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to this morning's Chair's Air Pollution Seminar by Franz Litz. We welcome those of you in attendance and those of you joining us by the webcast. AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, authorizes the Air Resources Board to implement a market-based mechanism to limit greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to other command and control measures. This is a new area for the Air Resources Board. To learn more about market-based mechanisms, we are bringing a series of experts to educate us and our interested stakeholders in this process. Today's speaker is the fourth in this series. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, known as RGGI, is a cap-and-trade program by 7 northeastern states to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from power plants in the region. Emissions trading under this initiative will begin January 1st, 2009. Governor Schwarzenegger and Governor Pataki recently agreed to explore potential ways to link California with the upcoming RGGI market. We are pleased to have here today Mr. Franz Litz, who has served as chair of the RGGI Working Group and as New York's principal representative to the initiative. His visit is especially timely as the Air Resources Board is very early in the process of designing an emissions trading market for California. Mr. Litz is the Climate Change Policy Coordinator for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, a position he has held since 2003. In that capacity, Mr. Litz serves as the Chief Policy Advisor on climate change issues to New York's Commissioner of Environmental Conservation. He also heads the agency's executive-level climate change office. Mr. Litz is a member of the advisory board of the Climate Group, a worldwide nonprofit organization dedicated to spotlighting positive action on climate change for businesses and governments. He is a participant in a number of ongoing climate change policy initiatives, including the Earth Institute's Global Roundtable on Climate Change and the Center for Clean Air Policy's National Climate Change Dialogue. Early in 2006, Mr. Litz was selected to study the European Union emissions trading scheme in depth as part of the European Union Visitors Program. I assume everybody in the room can hear me. I don't know about the webcast. Mr. Litz is a frequent contributor to and speaker at conferences on climate change policy and emissions trading worldwide. Prior to entering public service in New York in 2001, Mr. Litz practiced environmental law with Brown Rudnick, a Boston law firm, where he represented both private and public clients on a wide range of environmental matters. He is a graduate of Boston College Law School, where he served as executive editor of the Boston College Environmental Affairs Law Review, and he is a graduate of Union College. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Litz. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure to be here, and I do appreciate the invitation to come and tell you all about the things we're doing in New York, in general on climate, as well as focusing in on RGGI and some of the lessons we've learned in the design of that cap and trade program. Is this coming up? Is this coming over? It is? Okay. I want to start by sending my regrets, or passing on the regrets of our Commissioner Denise Sheehan, who was not able to be here. She really looked forward to coming out here to give part of this presentation. She was detained by a serious family matter that won't allow her to travel at this point, but she sends her regards. And before I get into the presentation, I also want to take a moment to commend California for its leadership on this issue. From the Pavley tailpipe standards to AB 32, the rest of the country does look in this direction to see some of the latest, greatest policy initiatives that are being tried out. We're pleased to have been invited to share our experience here with you, and we look forward to following up on those commitments that Governor Pataki and Governor Schwarzenegger made to work together. Because going it alone on this issue is really not an option. I mean, one state can act, and a state's action is important, but bringing as many other states along and other countries is extremely important. So having these kinds of back and forth, these dialogues that emphasize what states can do on their own and together is very, very important. Okay. In New York, as here in California, people choose to live there largely because of the climate that they experience. Believe it or not, even those of you from Southern California. But I was born and grew up in upstate New York, where we had great winters, and yet now we are seeing changes in that climate, very dramatic changes already documented. For example, average snow cover in parts of upstate New York has decreased by up to 30 days in a winter season. Very, very significant decreases. Our average annual temperatures, because we're further north, have increased greater than the global averages. So for the average annual temperature, we've already seen a 2% Fahrenheit average temperature increase. In the winter, it's more dramatic. In the winter, we've seen a 4-degree Fahrenheit average winter temperature increase in New York State over the last 35 years. So it's not about waiting for the science to come in. It's about looking at the scientific readings now, the observations that we've already made, and recognizing the correlations between the global warming and the changes we're seeing in our climate. Most people, when they think of New York, they think of New York City, and of course that's a big part of our population lives in and around the city of New York. And as you can imagine, you think of the subways, you think of all of the underground infrastructure, the tunnels, and it isn't hard to imagine the problem with even small increases in sea level rise. So not even referring to if Greenland disappears into the sea and we see feet increase. I'm talking even inches will have an impact on our New York City coastal infrastructure and the Long Island coastline, because as many of you probably know, when sea levels rise even modestly, storm surges become more powerful. And we've seen, we were just mentioning up here before the talk, we've seen retail insurance companies pull out of the insurance market in New York. They will no longer write policies on Long Island, for example. Allstate will not. And so we're moving here, we up in upstate New York, or we up in New York, far from really the hurricane belt, are starting to experience some of the same insurance problems that Florida has experienced. Florida has, as its largest insurer, the state insurance agency, and that is because private insurers will not cover the risk. And we're a little bit less commonly known for our really fantastic wilderness areas in upstate New York, where I am from. And there we are seeing changes. We're seeing changes in growing seasons, which have disruptive influences on ecological systems. I mentioned the decrease in snow cover, but we're expecting, with the increased warming, changes in forest species, so that the maple trees that are so much a part of our fall foliage season, that draw tourist dollars and are a big part of our regional identity when it comes to our climate, will be strained and stressed, and some projections have them completely leaving the Northeast region in favor of warmer weather species like the oak tree. And, people say, so what, maple trees, they're pretty and all, but it's more than just being pretty. It is those tourism dollars. It is the industries which rely on aspects of the climate. And before I move on to major New York climate policies, I want to just point out a couple of other things. Like California, New York purchases most of its energy from outside of the state, with the exception, of course, of the renewable energy that we produce inside the state. Policies that can reduce that dependency are positive from an economic standpoint and from an energy security standpoint. This is something that California knows very well and has recognized for decades now. But it's something that does drive policy in New York. Now I'm going to move into some major New York climate policies before I get into the RGGI part of the speech. And I want to note that, as some of you may already know, we had an election in November. Governor Pataki is retiring. He did not run again. And we have a new governor coming in next year. So these are policies that are currently in place, and many of us are very hopeful that we will not only continue the good record on climate change, but we'll actually be able to expand them and move in a more aggressive way on climate change under Governor Spitzer, who takes office January 1st. In New York, Governor Pataki started a greenhouse gas task force back in 2001. It's not unlike the climate action team that Governor Schwarzenegger put together. It was a very technically focused exercise consisting of stakeholders and representatives of agencies, and they did a survey of potential measures that could be taken to reduce emissions and did analyses to go with those potential measures to see what reductions we could get from which measures. That task force led to a number of the policy choices that the governor's administration has taken since. And although we don't have an AB 32, we have looked to bring policies to the various sectors of the economy. So that, and I'm going to go sector by sector just quickly to give you some examples of things we've done in this issue. Just to give you a flavor, though, our emissions inventory is somewhat different from what you have here in California. We have transportation is our largest sector. You do too. Ours is about 32% of the inventory. Electric generation is second at 25%. Buildings take up, both commercial and residential, are about another 25%. Industrial sources are a small 7% of the inventory. And I'm going to come back to the industrial source issue when we talk about RGGI, because industrial sources, of course, lend themselves to the same kind of cap and trade approach as electric sector sources do. We do have state reduction targets. These reduction targets are found in our state energy plan, which is not a legislative document, so it does not have the force of law. It is a planning document. It has more the force of an executive order. So whereas just as you had the governor's executive order, which was then, some of it was translated into AB 32, we have this plan which has not yet been converted into mandatory legislation. In the government sector, we've tried to reduce our energy use and continue to try, and to increase the amount of energy consumed in the form of renewables. And we have goals in place to accomplish those goals. And we want to convert the entire state vehicle fleet to zero-emission hybrid or alternatively fueled vehicles by 2010, and that is all the light-duty vehicles, not the heavy-duty vehicles. In the transportation sector, as I mentioned, our largest sector, we have followed California's lead in implementing the so-called PAVLI standards, our 1493 standards, which, of course, you here at CARB implemented and are in the process of defending with the help of some other states at your back. That, of course, will begin in 2009 and will represent a significant reduction for both New York and, as I know it will, for California in terms of meeting your emissions targets. We've also attempted to make biofuels more attractive in the state, both the production of biofuels and the use of biofuels. And our high energy efficiency rating now as a state is very much dependent on, or the result of, a really great mass transit system in and around New York City. In the building sector, we have an aggressive energy efficiency program. In fact, I think our folks at NYSERDA who run those programs tend to look to California as their primary competitor and in getting results on energy efficiency programs. We've moved to adopt stronger appliance and equipment efficiency standards. We were the first state to offer a green building tax credit, and in part due to that, but also just due to a green building craze, you can see in New York City a large number of green buildings, residential and commercial office buildings, going up, and we're very, very pleased to see that. And lastly, sequestration. This was not a policy adopted for its climate benefits, but since 1995, my department has sought to the preservation of an additional 1 million acres, the size of Rhode Island or half the size of Connecticut. And those are acres that will continue to sequester carbon and will not be developed despite continuing pressures to do so. And we've pushed to advance urban forestry objectives in the cities across the state to add trees, which of course not only sequester carbon but also serve as windbreakers in the winter, reducing fuel heating costs and energy use, and air conditioners in the summer. And lastly, the electric generating sector, which will segue into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Our renewable energy portfolio standard is set at 25% by 2013, so that by the end of 2013, the idea is we will, of all the electricity delivered in the state, 25% will come from renewable sources. And the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which was originally considered to be a state-only cap-and-trade program. The governor's staff considered having New York go out and do a cap-and-trade program on the power sector just for New York State. They decided to first reach out to the other Northeast states and see if they could bring them into the mix. And lo and behold, that was a successful approach. These slides are somewhat broken up because I just gave the part that my commissioner was supposed to give. So that's a background on some of the things we're doing to advance the climate action agenda in New York, and some of the reasons why we're doing it. For this segment of the briefing, I want to focus on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. I'll start with the regional process, give you a sense of the regional framework we put together, because bear in mind, this invitation went out to 11 governors, 9 of whom responded positively, and so we had 9 active states at the table, each of whom many of whom were Republican administrations, many of whom were Democrats, and each individual administration, of course, had its own priorities and wasn't used to having to compromise with other states to get things done. So the action plan was very crucial to the effort. Talk about the groundwork that we laid and the culmination of that groundwork and effort in the form of a memorandum of understanding signed by the governors of 7 states last December, and soon to be signed by 2 more states, Massachusetts and Maryland. So we'll be back up to 9. I'll then get into some of the key program components, some of the policy choices we made in designing the program, talk about the regional organization that the states will set up and how that might function to ensure that we continue to cooperate, not just on RGGI, but other energy issues as they relate to energy and environmental issues as they relate to climate change. And lastly, I just want to leave you with a thought of some thoughts on the magnitude of what a joint initiative between the RGGI states and California means in terms of addressing this problem. I think when you see the numbers involved, you'll agree that it makes sense for California to work with the RGGI states and push us along, and we can learn together in terms of the policies that we take. So it was April 2003 when Governor Pataki decided he would try this method of inviting other states along, and 6 of the 9 governors that responded favorably were Republican administrations. 3 were Democrats. In Pennsylvania and Maryland, they were positive, but they decided that they would observe the process. They wanted to take a more circumspect view of regulating carbon. And by July 2003, we launched it, and the first thing we did was come up with a group of staff and agency heads who would be directing the process. I can't say enough about the fact that it came from the governors, the fact that the governors gave us this mission and said they wanted to see this done. That helped us time and time again. It was not an easy effort, and there was considerable opposition to various aspects of the program, and still is to some aspects. But the fact that Governor Pataki and his counterparts said, we're going to do this, was very helpful in getting over those bumps. In September 2003, we came out with an action plan which was endorsed by the energy and environmental heads. Another thing that I think was very important, the cooperation between the environmental agency and the energy agency, working together side by side, meeting by meeting, figuring out how this climate policy, which is an environmental policy but also an energy policy, would impact the states and benefit the states. And that cooperation really played out in some surprising ways. We, I think, started very skeptical of each other. The Public Utility Commission folks sort of looked to us as the tree huggers, just to be very stereotypical, and bent on saving the world without any regard to electricity reliability. And on the PUC side, on the environmental side, we saw them as representatives of the electric power industry, in part. And this was partly because, the expertise on both sides goes in and out from environmental organizations to the environmental agency and then the power companies into the PUCs. There's a lot of overlap and back and forth between them. So clearly we have different perspectives, but it was that diversity of perspectives that ended up being a very positive factor. One important thing, and this is helpful to think of in terms of AB 32, it's economy-wide, of course, and RGGI is not. RGGI is power plants only. Very early on, in fact, in the original action plan, the states agreed that they would start with power plants because we had very good emissions data on power plants. And we had worked together before on power plant cap and trade programs. They decided that we would move to other sources later. So right up front in the action plan, it says, start with power plants, move to other sectors. What does this mean? What does this region really amount to in terms of emissions? I've added Maryland into these numbers because Maryland has legislation that was signed by their governor, which requires them to sign on. So we are, although they have not signed an amendment to the MOU, they are, for all intents and purposes, part of RGGI now. Massachusetts is not in these numbers, but Massachusetts governor takes office January 4th, has said that one of his first actions will be to sign RGGI and become part of this regional pact. So you can see if you were to take us, the states involved in RGGI, as a country, we would be the 11th largest emitter in the world, represent 15% of the U.S. economy and 13% of its population. And that's before you add Massachusetts in. So if it makes sense for, and this I should say, makes us comparable to some industrial countries, large industrial countries in Europe or Canada in terms of our emissions. So if it makes sense for a country of that size to act on this issue, it certainly makes sense for a group of states adding up to these numbers to take action. This is a diagram of the action plan, essentially. What we did is we said, this is how we would structure ourselves for making decisions. And again, each state is a sovereign entity. No group of states could force the hand of one individual state. So we had to come at each decision as a consensus decision, and that is in part the reason why it took us 3 years to reach agreement on the program's details. We broke up the tasks and we gave different tasks to different states to lead, and we formed, those representatives from the different agencies formed a staff working group. That's the group that I chaired, and periodically we would convene the energy and environmental agency heads. That took place about every quarter, and they would pass on the work that we did and also approve our next steps, our proposed next steps. And they in turn kept the governors apprised of the work that would go forward as we went forward. And the work, of course, and this is some of the stuff that I know you're busy working on for the economy-wide program here, making sure you have good data to start with, assembling the emissions data, very key, because if you don't have a good baseline, your reduction is meaningless against the baseline. Well, it could be meaningless or it could be overly aggressive if your numbers are off in the other direction. The impacts analysis, which included figuring out how this would impact the fuel mix in the region for generation. We have a very diverse fuel mix. It's natural gas, coal, nuclear, and renewables, and it's something that our energy folks pride themselves on and wanted to maintain, having a diverse fuel mix within the generation, within our region. So these modeling exercises looked at not just the cost of the program, but also the effect on fuel diversity and the larger macroeconomic impacts. We had a very extensive stakeholder process. We looked for a cross-section of stakeholders that represented various interests in the region, made up of 25. We came up with a panel of 25. They met 12 or 13 times over the course of 2.5 years to debate various issues that we put before them, and including how the modeling would be done. So they actually had a role in deciding what the assumptions would be in the modeling, which was very painful. The stakeholder process also had expert workshops where we brought in experts to sit on panels on different topics. We looked at allocations of emissions. We looked at impacts on the electricity markets. We looked at offsets, which I'll talk about in a minute. We looked at auctions, specifically auctioning allowances in one of the workshops. And there was another one too, but I can't think of it. But we just brought the stakeholders together with the staff from the states and said, all right, let's learn about this issue together. And that was very valuable because we were able, when actually making the decision, they understood the reasons for the decisions. Even if they didn't agree, they understood them. And that led us to 2005 in December. Toward the end of the negotiations, because it was a consensus effort, it was about making everybody happy. And we had the agency heads from the environmental and energy agencies on the phone daily in the last 2 or 3 weeks, trying to make Massachusetts happy, essentially, to bring them on, and to no avail. Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney refused to sign the MOU. As I mentioned, his successor has said he will sign it as one of his first actions in office. So some of the changes we made to make Massachusetts happy in the end weren't necessary, and they happen to be personally some of the things I could do without on the program. But so we have the 7 states. We'll have Massachusetts. We'll have Maryland. We're also going to be looking to Rhode Island, although they're a very small emitter. They're nonetheless important. One other thing that I often fail to mention, when you're looking at this group of states, it's 2 senators from each state and a whole bunch of representatives. Something you know well here, your California congressional delegation can be very powerful in Washington. But as we add states that are actively acting on this issue, we amass delegations, hopefully, that are likewise sympathetic to action on a federal level. And so a state like Rhode Island may not be significant in terms of its emissions, but it too has 2 senators in Congress and can have a big impact in regional and national policies. And then the West Coast link, we've been hopeful all through our process. It was, I guess, your Governor Davis who announced before he left office that he announced the Western Governors Global Warming Initiative. And from the time that was announced, we have been very hopeful to link to the West Coast and create a kind of pinching effect across the country on this issue, or at least surround them on 2 sides. How does RGGI work? We did not reinvent the wheel with RGGI, and that's an important lesson. We based RGGI on existing programs which have proven to be very successful at reducing emissions at a low cost. The first example is the federal SO2 emissions trading program. It's very similar in structure to that program, just as the European Union emissions trading scheme is also based on that SO2 program. So all of the carbon programs that you see in place, including the voluntary CCX when they come, Chicago Climate Exchange, will tell you they based their program on the SO2 trading program. So all of the carbon trading programs in existence or about to be in existence are largely based on that experience, which we had used in the nitrogen oxide context. We had a NOx regional trading program in the Northeast, and our sources found that to be very effective and allowed them the flexibility that they needed to keep costs down, and it achieved the emissions reduction goal. So RGGI is essentially the same thing. Well, what is that? You look at a set of sources. You determine which sources you're going to cover. You figure out how much comes out of those sources. What are the emissions of those sources? And that gives you your baseline. And you decide then, well, what kind of reduction do we want from these sources? And that gives you your cap level. And it may be at your baseline, or it might be lower than your baseline by a certain percentage. Or it may change over time. It may start at your baseline and go down over time. That's the cap. Allowances are permits to emit one ton of pollution. And so each state takes a cap and divvies up the cap in terms of tons of pollution and distributes the allowance in some way, and we call that allocations. And I'm going to come back to that. In the past, they've either been given away based on past emissions in the SO2 program, or in the various programs in the NOx trading system in the Northeast, we allowed states to do it differently. So we had some states do it based on units of output. We had some states do it based on heat input, some based on past emissions, with various little set-asides to accomplish complementary goals. I'm going to come back to how we're doing it in RGGI. That's one of the innovations of this program. So you have the cap, which amounts to the emissions you want to see coming out of the covered sources. And you have allowances that are distributed into the market somehow. And then you have a requirement that's placed on each source. Each source has to cover every ton of emissions with one allowance. So at the end of a compliance period, it looks at its emissions account and says, all right, how many tons have I put into the atmosphere? That is the number that I have to cover with allowances in my allowance account. As regulators, it's a very easy program to administer, at least from this one perspective. You look all the regulator has to do is look at the two accounts. If there are enough allowances to cover the emissions account, then the source is in compliance. End of story. You debit the account of the allowances, and you move on to the next account. But it's this requirement that each source cover its emissions with allowances that brings the market dynamic into play, because each source has to say to itself, all right, I can reduce my emissions through whatever method, whether it's a control equipment or an efficiency improvement, or not operating as much, changing fuels. Or I can go out and buy allowances from some other source that reduces its emissions. And the market dynamic functions to distribute the reductions in a way that is most cost effective. That's the idea. Only those sources that can reduce emissions most cheaply, most cost effectively, will do so. The rest will purchase allowances. And then you end up with a full distribution of reductions in accordance to cost effectiveness rather than the alternative, which would be the agency saying every plant reduce emissions by a certain amount or reduce it down to a certain performance level. It's that trading which produces the benefit. Just some illustration here. Because we're all different states, we'll all have little mini RGGI programs in our states. Separate cap and trade programs that interact together. And we're all in the process of putting those programs on our books right now. We just proposed our rule last week. And you can see that each state gets a budget, and that state then determines how those allowances go into the market, whether they're passed to sources or sold or otherwise. When we went to set the cap for this program, you can imagine that was one of the biggest issues that we had to confront as a group of states. How stringent will this program be? How much are we willing to pay for reductions? And we did all kinds of analysis of different cap levels to see what the economic impact would be. And we settled on this reduction path: stabilize emissions for 5 full years, and then reduce emissions by 10%. And those of you who have followed the discussion here in California, you know that one of the biggest nut to crack in structuring these caps is taking care of growth, fending off the growth. So if you could stop emissions growth right there, you're actually taking a bigger bite out of your emissions situation than if you seek a reduction. So when you look at this, it says 10% reduction by 2019. Well, that's by far the smallest part of the reduction we're accomplishing. 25% comes just from not allowing this sector to grow. We're about 3% below 1990 levels across the 7 states right now, and we'll be 13% below 1990 levels, roughly, based on the reductions called for by the program, which, based on our middle-of-the-road trajectory, it's 35%. Our business-as-usual range was between 25% growth and 45% growth in the sector, so 35% represents the middle-of-the-road projection on the business-as-usual. As the chairman mentioned in the introduction, the program will launch January 1st, 2009. We'd actually expect, based on prior experience, that trading will occur prior to that. Assuming that there'll actually be some market activity before the program launches between sources who will attempt to lock up allowances in advance. It covers power plants 25 megawatts and greater, which is more than 99% of the emissions, and compliance from the sector. And I mentioned that the compliance obligation is essentially to cover your emissions with allowances. One of the innovations here in RGGI and this is a lesson that we learned from the EU emissions trading scheme largely, the European Union has a deregulated power market, which means their power market functions on a free market principle. And the providers bid in to supply their power to meet the demand of electricity. And essentially, they take the top bidder that's necessary, the most expensive emitter necessary to cover the load. That sets the price in the market. And so the generators essentially, when they're making their bid to supply electricity, look at their list of costs. All right, what does it cost me to supply this megawatt hour of power? One of the costs, of course, is fuel. There are incremental labor costs in some cases. There are other allowance costs. In the U.S., for example, there's the SO2 allowances necessary in some cases. In the Northeast and the NOx-SIPCAL region, which is mostly east of the Mississippi, they have NOx allowances that they need to build into their price. And the RGGI allowance will go right in there too. So you end up with a stack of costs, and that's their bid. They stack up all their costs, whatever that amount is per megawatt hour. They bid that into the market. And imagine our surprise in the environmental agencies when we were told, and our counterparts in the power, in the public utility commissions explained to us this dynamic, and they said to us, you know, they're going to bid in the price of the allowance whether you give them the allowance for free or if you charge them for it. And I said, wait a minute, that makes no sense. That's counterintuitive. You mean we're going to give them the allowance for free and they're going to turn around and charge consumers for it? And they said yes. And the various examples were used to try to beat some sense into our heads. And one of them, which I like to pass on because it made the light bulb go off in my head, is that if you give a gas station a free tanker full of gasoline, you just roll up one day, unload gasoline, and say, this is yours for free, buddy. It's all yours. What is that gas station owner going to do? Is he going to turn around and give the gasoline away for free, or is he going to charge the consumer for that gasoline? Allowances are a commodity, just like fuel. And so as we were thinking about this allowance dynamic and how we would do our allocations, that light bulb went off and said, wait a minute, that means that they're going to be charging for something they got for free and increase their revenues in the process. At the same time, the first year of the EU emissions trading program was unfolding, and the large industrial and commercial consumers over there were up in arms, really, really angry. They were watching the electric generators in their markets charge for these allowances, and the prices were going through the roof. We'll talk about that a little bit because I have a question on it. And they were watching them charge for these allowances that they got for free. In some case, 40 euros, 30 euros a ton. And they said, something's not right here. We're paying for a program. They're padding their pockets, and we're not seeing the benefit. So there have been lots of calls in the EU to auction allowances or to give them to the consumers who actually end up having to pay for the program. So long story short, in RGGI, the political process led us to an agreement in which 25%, at least 25% of the allowances would be allocated to what we spent weeks negotiating was the consumer benefit and or strategic energy purposes. And that meant that states could take the 25%. The goal here was to make sure that the consumers benefit from these 25%. And they would either get them in terms of consumer rebates, energy efficiency investments, or investments in clean energy technologies, and that included renewable energy. We announced last week our proposal in New York that we will be auctioning 100% of our allowances, and that will be the first time that that's been done in any emissions cap and trade program. And Vermont has legislation that requires them to do the same. So at least 2 of the RGGI states will be auctioning 100%. We expect that others will follow. Most likely Connecticut and New Jersey will at least seriously consider some higher percentage amount between 25 and 100%. I saw there was a hand up. We're going to do all the questions at the end. That's okay. So just please hold it. The RGGI program also incorporates a bunch of flexibility mechanisms that were not present in the SO2 market, the federal SO2 market, or the regional NOx program and the NOx-SIPCAL cap and trade program, which are currently in place. This first one we took from the EU. They found in their first year of operating that a lot of the sources were shifting to co-fire biomass. And the reason for that was sustainably harvested biomass is considered carbon neutral in the EU scheme. And the sources were using biomass as a compliance method. We hope to do the same, or we plan to do the same. We are doing the same in RGGI. So a coal plant that wants to produce the same amount of power can co-fire biomass, produce the same amount of energy, but at lower emissions and therefore lower carbon cost. We allow banking. This is a lesson that we learned from Reclaim. One of the lessons we took from the trading program in Southern California, the Reclaim market, did not allow banking between compliance periods, and that was the experts tell us one of the problems with that program. So the NOx program and now RGGI have banking based on that lesson. The early reduction credits will allow sources to earn credits that they can apply in their accounts once the program launches. So this is for the period beginning when the MOU was signed, December 2005, through the launch of the program. If they make improvements at their plants that both reduce emissions and improve their output rate, so fewer pounds of CO2 per unit of megawatt hours produced, they can earn early reduction credits. This last one, because CO2 is we're not worried about carbon dioxide concentrations in the short term like we are with NOx, well, mercury is a better example. Mercury is not an appropriate pollutant to have emissions trading for because you're looking at least that's the position we've taken in New York. Some other states are having emissions trading. But you're looking at short-term concentrations in a particular location with mercury. And that's why you need to be very concerned about hotspots which occur with trading. You don't get hotspots with CO2 because CO2 disperses very rapidly in the atmosphere. So the reduction can happen anywhere and have the same impact. And you could have, in a 3-year period, you could have all of the emissions in the first year and none in the second 2 years and have the same climate impact. So we decided to go with a 3-year compliance period to weather the weather, to help plants get over those sometimes weather-driven spikes in emissions or drops in emissions. This allows them to smooth them over a 3-year period. Not unlike the EU program, which, although they don't have a 3-year compliance period because their periods overlap, they essentially have a multi-year compliance period as well. And lastly, offsets. Oops. Offsets are project-based reductions, for those of you who don't know. They by definition take place outside of the capped sector. So in this case, we're capping power plants. If California caps power plants and all industrial sources, your offsets presumably will come from outside of those capped sectors. And you are essentially looking for valid, genuine reductions outside of the sector. I was just down in North Carolina talking to them about RGGI. And for RGGI, what we did is we said, this could be our big legacy. We could create the gold standard for offsets in RGGI. We want real, legitimate reductions. We want reductions that even the most extreme environmentalists will look at and say, now that's good stuff. Or almost the most extreme. So we set out to come up with standards. We came up with the requirements up front, and we have established a short list of offset types. And if you look at our rule, under methane capture from farms, you can walk through the rules and figure out exactly what project would qualify for offsets. Now you can imagine, based on my preface remark, that some people think our standards are too stringent, that we're not allowing valid reductions in. And that is probably true. I think throughout these standards, what we did is we set our offset criteria in a way that would err on the side of legitimate reductions. and not on the side of letting in less legitimate reductions. And as one of the first out of the box with this kind of a program, we felt that was our duty, because those that follow after us and set up cap and trade programs, if we had come up with a real cockamamie scheme for offsets, then that disables all of those who design programs after us. And we've had our mind, and I didn't mention this, but we've had our mind set on being an example for the national debate. When the national program comes into effect, we want RGGI to be the model. And it's not to say that all of these choices that we've made will be seen as good choices. We expect there to have been some bad choices or some slightly off choices. But those lessons will likewise be very positive when it comes time to design the next cap and trade program. And if it turns out it's all a bunch of state programs across the country, so be it. But our eyes were on the prize of a federal program. And that's partly why we chose this framework, this SO2-based framework. We used the federal model rule for doing the cap and trade program. That was our basis. We did that because we felt that it was a very easy and logical step to go from this program design to a federal program. So back, I digress. The other offsets, methane capture from farms, convert land to forest. In terms of forestry offsets, this was the one that we thought was calculable and really doable in terms of maintaining its legitimacy. We are going to look at forest management and forest preservation going forward, but there were problems that were brought to our attention in the initial look at that to at least make us want to spend some more time on it. SF6 gas leak prevention and landfill gas capture at small landfills. So this would be the smaller landfills that aren't required to capture their landfill gas under the federal rules. And end-use energy efficiency projects. And here I need to mention that this does not include electricity end-use efficiency. And that should really say fossil fuel end-use. So what we're looking at is space heating and cooling, where the emissions occur at the facility being heated or cooled as a result of that activity. So essentially, we're looking for programs that go in and reduce the energy consumed in heating and cooling at buildings, which you'll remember at the beginning represents about 26% of our emissions from buildings in the heating and cooling of water and space. And lastly, in terms of we do have a way to interact with the international regime. One of the things we added to the program at the end in an attempt to win over Governor Romney in Massachusetts was a safety valve for offsets. We have an offsets valve that opens up. When the program launches, a source can use only 3.3% of the total emissions can be covered by offsets. That sounds like an absurd number, and we know that. But it represents the projected about 50% of the compliance obligation. So in essence, we're saying sources, you have to come up with at least 50% of the reduction on system. The other 50% can come from offsets. What we said is if the allowance price ends up being higher than we anticipate, as the allowance price goes up, we'll let in more offsets. So at $7, once the price reaches $7, if it does, then sources can use 5%, can cover 5% of their emissions with offsets. Now, bear in mind, we started this cap at a stabilization level. So it's at current levels. So when we talk about offsets, that builds in a little growth until we get to the part of the cap declining. So that's why we're very cautious about bringing in offsets into the program. And then when it hits $10, the international currencies will be recognized. So we'll allow EU ETS allowances and CDM credits, which is the international offset regime. And these are functioning up and running markets where the commodity already exists. So RGGI will not drive that market, but it'll be a currency that will be usable in our market above that price. Okay, just a few more slides. One of the big challenges, as you can imagine, in dealing with multiple states is, again, that you have decision makers that lead sovereign entities, and they don't constitutionally have to answer to anybody other than their own legislatures, their own constituents. And so we need to come up with ways to facilitate regional cooperation or multi-state cooperation without ceding our sovereign authority. And the RGGI Regional Organization will serve that role. There will be a technical assistance organization that will help the states implement RGGI, whether it's providing technical advice on offset applications or serving as the agent for the emissions reporting system. The precise functions are really yet to be mapped out, but we're planning to launch that organization in the early part of next year. And some of us hope that that organization will, because it'll bring in energy and environmental heads together, will serve as a platform for further communication between those that focus on energy and those that focus on environment going forward. Okay, these are some fun numbers. When Governor Schwarzenegger was coming to New York, we had to quickly put together a briefing for him and for his Cali BA secretary. And we thought it would be cool to think about, all right, well, if we're going to try to work together, what does that mean in terms of impact? And you can see here that it's really quite astounding. We represent together, and this does not include Massachusetts, so these numbers will go up a little bit. We represent 24% of the U.S. population, 28% of its economy. If we were treated as a country, we would be the third largest economy behind Japan and the rest of the U.S. And we represent 15% of the U.S. emissions, sixth largest emitter. So a real powerhouse when it comes to, I should say, we represent a large set of emissions, so a large responsibility on this group of states to reduce emissions, but also a real political and economic powerhouse in terms of driving the new economies of tomorrow, which will help us to produce our energy sustainably. The goal we expressed in that meeting was to have seamless trading between RGGI and California. Whether California submitted its power plants to RGGI wasn't necessarily the issue, but rather having whatever system that you design here in California be able to trade seamlessly across the country and accomplish some of that east-west coming together was the goal, and still our goal, I hope. All right, this is my conclusion, and then we can get into some discussion and questions. Each RGGI state is currently putting RGGI on the books. So what we have is an agreement by the governors of the states on a set of rules, and we have a model set of rules which are extremely detailed, a model rule. And now it comes to promulgating those rules, getting them on the books in each state. In the next year, we'll be talking about adding Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and we'll be looking to Pennsylvania, Governor Rendell in his second term, to take the jump into RGGI. We'll be hoping to talk more and more about a connection to California, and we want to help in any way that we can to facilitate that. And we'll always have our eye out for potential links with other West Coast states. New Mexico and Arizona, you may know, have taken some real solid steps in the direction that you've moved here in California, and hopefully those steps will take them further down the path. And lastly, recognize additional international currencies. You may know that the Australian states are attempting to come up with a cap-and-trade program similar to RGGI because it covers only power plants, which is by far their biggest emitter. And all of the states are getting together to design a trading scheme. In the Australian states, they're calling it the National Emissions Trading Scheme because they have all the states of Australia involved. And this despite the fact that Prime Minister Howard's position is to not have mandatory restraints, much like ours. So those are the next steps, and it's been my pleasure to give this presentation, and we can take some questions. Start with them? Oh, I'm supposed to start with these that came down. someone was especially studious and sent questions in before. Okay. What system assurance procedures or processes will be established to prevent the type of confidence meltdown experienced in European markets several months ago? And this came from, did I say the name? This came from Steve Rice, who is from Brown and Caldwell in Allendale, New Jersey. You know, you can talk to two different people and get two different takes on what happened in Europe, so you're about to get one person's take. I don't see it as a confidence meltdown. I see what happened in Europe. Actually, let me back up so I can give you the facts. In Europe, they, during the first year of trading, saw prices rise to 30, 35 euros. And then when the emissions data was released earlier this year, at the end of the first compliance period, which was 1 year, everybody said, whoa, wait a minute, there are more allowances than we thought and lower emissions. And there was a major price correction that came down to about 15, 16 euros, cut the price in half. And so the question was, well, is that a problem? And I suppose it's a problem that the information was such in the first year of the program, that those participating in the market did not know how to price the commodity. They priced the commodity much too high. And I've talked to the EU folks about this a little bit, if they did what we did, sounds typical American, right? If you had only done what we did, if they had quarterly reporting of emissions, publicly reporting of emissions, then it'd make it much easier for market participants to track emissions against the allowance supply. They'd have better information and be better able to price the commodity. So I think that would stave off the need for such large corrections in the future. If there was a confidence meltdown, I think it was that this was their first cap and trade program, and they started off a little jittery about doing cap and trade. I think here in the States, when we do cap and trade, the companies and the market participants are much, much better versed in dealing with these emissions commodities markets, and I think we're going to see a little bit less of that. There's always a little volatility, or at least history tells us in these markets you get a little volatility up front, but we're hoping that we won't see that kind of volatility in the RGGI market or in a future federal or California market. The second question that came in before the presentation is there any intention, thought, or discussion of extending RGGI beyond power plants to other industries wishing to participate, such as petrochemical or natural gas transmission and distribution? As I mentioned during the presentation, the original action plan for RGGI calls for us to first do the power plants, get it in place, and then extend to other sources. So we would expect, because of that commitment and the fact that California has done AB 32, I mean, everyone in state climate circles is now talking about who's going to be next to do an AB 32 approach. And I'm not going to stand here and say it's going to be New York, because I don't know, and it won't be me who makes that decision. But there are a lot of states considering economy-wide legislative caps and whether they would work in their states as a result of what you've done here. So, go ahead.
Are we supposed to identify ourselves before? Okay. Gary Ackerman, the Western Power Trading Forum, and I have a couple of clarification questions on especially the auctioning of the allowances. I think I understand, but maybe you can just go over it because, for example, in the case of New York where you say you're going to auction 100% of the allowances, who can bid on those allowances? It's not limited, right, in terms of just power plant generation asset owners in the state of New York. I'm assuming that anybody could bid, whether it be an intermediary, it could be a power plant in another state, et cetera. Otherwise, I'm struggling as how this makes sense. But the follow-on question is then, do the allowances just go to particular power plants within the state? Maybe you could elaborate and help me out there.
The web folks can hear that, right? I don't need to repeat it? Okay. Excellent questions. In our rule, when we incorporated the auction provision, what we did is we sat down and we thought with our regional counterparts and with representatives of our power market. We said, all right, what principles should guide the design of the auction? And we in New York came up with a set of principles that would guide our auction, and we think they'll be agreeable across the region. And they include things like mechanisms to avoid exercise of market power for manipulation. So, I mean, that could take a number of forms, such as maybe a limit on the number of allowances you could accumulate, or other non-participatory mechanisms. So we're hoping to have an open market where anyone can participate, but we want to incorporate mechanisms that prevent market manipulation. And these I'm told from the experts we've talked to, are common concerns when you're setting up an auction in the commodities context. So we're hoping to learn from the auctions that have been designed previously, and we'll do some analysis and some testing of our proposed auction before we incorporate it. And then the last thing is, how do the allowances get into the entity's hands?
If there's allocation instead of auction, because I'm still not sure whether or not anybody can bid at auction or not.
Anyone can bid at the auction.
Thanks. Now, in an allowance, let's say you don't auction off 100%, let's say some smaller percentage. The state then is in control of how those allowances get allocated to individual power plants within the state. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's up to each individual state to allocate that remaining 75%. They choose to allocate to sources at no cost. They can do it on several different bases. They could do it on output, pounds per megawatt hour of output. They could do it on heat input. It could be fuel specific, a different method for coal, different method for gas, different method for oil, or it could be fuel neutral. So there's quite a number of different options, and you'll see those debated in the different states as they come out with their state-specific proposals, which will take place this month and the next couple of months. They're going to bring you a mic, so you'll be right after this, John.
Hi, Chris Bush, Union of Concerned Scientists. Just wanted to talk a little more about the auctioning. Was economic modeling part of your process in feeling comfortable in auctioning 100% of your allowances? I saw a memo that talked about the state or the power producers' abilities to deal with the volatility in oil and gas as giving you comfort that they'll be able to deal with whatever additional costs might come with the permits. But if you could just talk about that a little bit.
In a deregulated market, we did extensive modeling. In the deregulated market, it's not going to matter in terms of the ultimate price to consumers, whether you charge them for the allowance or you give them it for free. So those analyses which attempted to look at the cost of the program hold true regardless of the allocation method. That's number one. Number two, there are potentially disparate impacts on the power generators themselves, depending on the way that the allowances are allocated. That's always been the case. Whenever you start a emissions cap and trade program, when you're allocating the allowances, you're really picking winners and losers. So if you go fuel neutral, as I just mentioned, you're probably benefiting lower carbon intensity fuels. If you chose a fuel specific where you gave a different one to coal, a different metric to coal, a different metric to gas, you're then probably leveling the playing field a little bit. But nonetheless, there will always be some who make out well, others who make out less well. In auctions, it'll tend to be, I think, just off the cuff, it'll tend to be those plants that operate not at the margin and that have a higher carbon intensity. So bear with me a minute. If you're a coal plant, for example, where you have to match every megawatt hour with 2 allowances, and you're not setting the price, let's say a natural gas power plant is setting the price, that natural gas plant is putting in a carbon adder that is less than half of what I would put in as the coal plant down below. And so the overall power prices are going up, but they're not going up enough to cover the allowance cost of that high carbon intensity plant. And that's going to vary depending on area of the market that you're talking about, the bidding area, the area covered by that pricing area. Does that answer your question? We've done all kinds of thinking and analysis, and we're probably not done with that either.
Actually, I have a microphone, so.
One from the web. This gentleman here was next.
Okay.
All right, some from the web. This is from Virginia Gross, I think, sorry if I mispronounced your name, of Southern California Edison. Question number 1. I understand that in 2004, RGGI explored what would be involved with a load-based cap system as opposed to a source-based cap system. What are the reasons and factors that caused RGGI to ultimately adopt a source-based cap system as opposed to a load-based cap system? That is correct. We did consider, well, let me back up. Our track record is with the track record in the country and in our state is with generator source-based cap and trade programs. To my knowledge, there's never been a load-based cap system tried. So the first state to do it, and it may be California, will be creating something new. We had a bunch of design principles for our program. One was we wanted to maximize the chances that it would be a national model. We thought because we used the federal model rule for cap and trade programs, we were maximizing that potential. Our sources already were familiar with source-based cap and trade programs. They know how they work. The third reason was we considered some of the issues involved in load-based systems, which, to my knowledge, have not been resolved as yet, but are being worked on. One is how you how you actually measure the carbon attributable to a certain megawatt hour of power. Because as you know, once the electrons hit the grid, there's no way to trace those electrons, or it's hard to trace the electrons back to their source. And in contrast, the source-based system actually measures the emissions at the stack. And so there's a high level of confidence of how much is going into the air and who's responsible for it. And so the integrity of those emissions reductions is really without question in terms of the reductions on the plants. The second thing is that, what were the other reasons we considered? Oh, the other issue that was involved with the load-based system, which to my knowledge has been worked on, is this concept of contract shuffling. With a cap and trade based, generator based, you have an issue with leakage. It's where you're putting the cap on one area, and that area trades with another area that's not capped. And so the theory is, or the concept is, when you put the restraint on the one area, you're incentivizing the import of uncontrolled power, uncapped power, leading to what they call emissions leakage. That's an issue with cap and trade programs that are based on the source. But the flip side issue for the load-based cap is that you're attempting to influence the mix outside of your region. And let me just take a local example that I know well. Pennsylvania has nuclear power, and they're not part of RGGI. Let's say I decide to impose a mechanism, a load-based cap and trade program that puts a premium on that low-carbon energy outside of the region. And all of a sudden, I'm paying a premium to buy nuclear power in Pennsylvania, and those coal plants that I used to buy from are now just shifting their service to another customer. And that's been sometimes referred to as contract shuffling. And so that raises the question of integrity of your load-based cap, and it has to be addressed for it to really work out. And I guess the short answer is neither is perfect. Neither system is perfect, and there will be issues that you need to confront in either system. But we opted for the one that we felt was tried and true, the source-based approach. Do I have to answer more than one, or just one, or one more? Okay. Amy Royden. Hi, Amy. Amy is with STAPA ALAPCO, which is a National Association of Clean Air Agencies. Assuming a national GHG program is adopted, do you think there is still a role for a program like RGGI? The official answer refers you to the Memorandum of Understanding among the states, which says that in the event of a national program, the states will take measures to, and I'm paraphrasing, harmonize the program to the extent practical. And there were people at the table from the states who felt that means it would go away. RGGI would go away in the event of a national program. But really the trouble with answering this program, and trouble we confronted when we tried to address the issue in the Memorandum of Understanding was it's hard to predict the future. It's hard to know what that federal program will look like. And the states really kept their options open as to whether the RGGI would go away if there's a national program. My gut tells me that if the national program is as good as or better than RGGI, RGGI would go away. And then, of course, the National Congress can take this choice right out of our hands by preempting RGGI with their program if they choose. I mean, that's a prerogative of the national legislature.
Hi, Rob Schladel with the Department of Finance. I'm just wondering whether you and New York have discussed what you'll do with the revenue that you may generate by auctioning off the allocations, whether you'll use it for things like promoting energy efficiency and other elements that would help climate change, or whether it will be used for other purposes.
Great question. What we did is we took the definition that the states had agreed to together, which included consumer, energy efficiency, clean energy technologies, and renewable, and we narrowed it down a little bit for New York. We said it could be used for energy efficiency or clean energy technologies that show a significant promise for emissions reductions. That's paraphrased, but that's roughly what our rule says. So, and the reason for that is we felt that the evidence was pretty clear that smaller investments in energy efficiency have bigger payback in terms of reducing ultimate consumer costs than tiny consumer rebates. So if we took that money, recycled it back to the consumers, we would probably not have much of an impact at all on rates. But by investing it in energy efficiency, we felt we could get much more bang for those bucks.
Okay. Elizabeth McCarthy with California Energy Circuit. How is non-compliance dealt with at the state level and at the program level? Penalties or?
Non-compliance. Let me start by saying in these types of programs, compliance has been almost 100%. It's been remarkable. There's very little enforcement that has taken place in the existing programs. And I attribute that to really speaking the language of the regulated. These regulated bodies are used to dealing with commodities. They're constantly getting the commodities. They're looking for the fuel to cover out into the future. They're trading on the commodities markets. They're trading on the emissions markets. They can cover their obligation, and they're pretty adept at doing it. If by chance they do not comply, however, and in the past it's largely been dumb errors. A plant will come in and say, "Gee, we just messed up. There was an addition error." But if they don't, then our rule says that they have to cover the allowance deficit 3-to-1. So it's a 3-to-1 penalty. And a state could change that. They could say that they want a $50 per ton penalty. You could do it lots of different ways, but the point is, because the allowance price fluctuates, we wanted to tie it to the number of allowances that they would have to cover the deficit with. And then we reserve all the criminal and civil penalties that otherwise exist under our laws. Yeah, so those are always reserved on the side in the event that they're warranted in the exercise of enforcement discretion. Okay. How did RGGI end up addressing the leakage issue? This is from Sempra Utilities, David Barker. And also Sierra Club had Michael Endicott, how do you control for leakage, to promoting expansion of coal-fired plants, especially if looking up with Arizona and Utah. This is the leakage question I mentioned. You put the constraint on one area, the outside area is not constrained, and you're concerned about imports from that unconstrained area into the constrained area. It undermines your cap by essentially allowing people to go around your restriction, getting power from the outside. We did a lot of modeling around this question and found that, according to the modeling results, leakage is an issue. You'll hear sometimes people talk about this leakage issue as undermining the entire program. I think that overstates it. We looked at it, it's somewhere between 20 and 35% potential dilution of the cap, which is significant. It's a problem that we felt we needed to address. In the MOU among the states, we pledged to work in parallel on a mechanism to address that issue. So with RGGI, we're focused on emissions within our states. The leakage effort, which is underway, will examine methods that probably the PUCs would implement to reduce the potential for dirty power coming in the state. Now, you have a couple of examples already, I think, here. 1683, 1368. Well, all the numbers are in there, I think. 1368, which says you can't buy anything that's worse than a natural gas combined cycle rate. That's one way to do it. Another way, you have an emissions portfolio standard. I think if not on the books, it's pretty close. And that would be a way to address imported power and attempt to regulate it the same way you regulate in-state power. And then thirdly, there's this idea of requiring load-serving entities to cover the emissions attributable to the imported power with allowances. So you'd essentially print up some more allowances based on the baseline attributable to the imported power, and they would serve as quasi-generators in your cap and trade system, and you'd bring them in that way. There's some issues with that, and I mentioned a couple of them. One is tracking, and the other is just being assured that the electrons are actually attributable to the, it's attributing the electrons, attributing the environmental attribute to the electron, the emission rate, and doing so in a way that does not interfere with interstate commerce. And I know your PUC is working very actively on coming up with solutions to that, and they're probably the ones to talk to.
ARB, good to see you. Yeah. Following up on Rob's question on the revenue flow, do you have an estimate of how much money you're talking about? I did a back of the envelope in like $300 million or something like that. But anyway, I'd be interested in how much money you think you're talking about, and would your thinking about how to use that money change if you broaden to other sectors and you had a much larger pot you were talking about? So, for instance, in a California context.
That's a great question. The first one, we have about 65 million tons. So if they're $1 a piece, that's $65 million, and then you can multiply it by whatever the allowance value ends up being. It's probably going to be somewhere between $2 and $5 based on our projections, and no one ever knows for sure. It is a significant amount of money. So if it's $2, it's still $120 million, which is not chump change. And if it's $3, it's more, obviously. And, well, it's like 3 times 65, 195. Math in my head. So I explained how we plan to, at least in our proposal, to spend the money, and that will also be subject to the decisions of the incoming governor's administration as to how that actually gets channeled, I suspect, because we won't have our rule final until they come in. Would the considerations change if we expand into the industrial sector? I bet it would. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really given much thought in terms of how it would change. My guess is whether or not we would auction at all to the industrial sources would be the first consideration, because the question would be, are those sources passing on the cost of the allowance? Are they able to? If they're not, then the rationale for the auction in the first place may not exist as to industrial sources. And then once you got over that hurdle and you're still going to auction to the industrial sector, then maybe then you'd have to figure out how best to invest the money. Maybe you'd want to invest it in technologies that would help those sources reduce their carbon load. Just off the top of my head. Do I have to take 2 from here now? Has the time frame been set for RGGI looking at the transportation sector after power plants? In the transportation, that's from Andrew Nix of WVU. West Virginia University, okay. We have Governor Pataki, even before Governor Schwarzenegger was elected, I think, said he was going to follow the Pavley rule, and he stuck to that. So we now have the Pavley rule in effect in New York, which will reduce emissions from the tailpipes of light-duty vehicles. Otherwise, in the transportation sector, I think we're looking at keeping mass transit low cost, biofuels. We have a number of proposals to make cellulosic ethanol in New York, particularly upstate New York, to complement the agricultural economies there. And we have thought about a fleet-based offset for RGGI that would allow companies to get credits for reducing their fleet emissions, but that's really just a concept at this point. I don't think there has been much traction on the idea of attempting to bring in the transportation sector into a cap-and-trade program. It's hard to imagine how that could be accomplished. Different tools for different sectors.
Richard McCann with M-Cubed. Quick comment and then a question. First, I think that you might, and California has to consider this as well, is that you might have to live with leakage, because the real point of these programs is not the actual emission reductions, but rather as pilot programs for other states and the nation and other parts of the world to follow. So you're really should be focused on designing the programs that are effective in larger schemes rather than focusing on just how it's going to work with your states, because the total emission reductions that you get from just your states or from California is actually pretty minuscule in the global concept. But the second question I have is California, the only program that we're working on is a load-based one at this moment, the one that's going on at the PUC for the electricity sector. Do you foresee a problem integrating that with a generation-based program like RGGI's based on? And I guess actually there's even problems of integrating it perhaps even with the acid rain program.
Those are excellent points. One of the reasons, which I didn't mention for us doing the source base, was that Europe did the source based. And not only had we done it in the past with pollutants, but Europe did the source based, and we wanted to maximize consistency across countries. Even though we were sub-country entities, we thought it was part of our charge. I think there are issues with making sure that the currency that comes out of a load-based cap and trade is consistent with one in a source-based. But as long as both sides can be assured that a ton of reduction in one system equals a ton in another, I don't really see a problem. But I mean, you have to get over some of those issues. If you have to get past this contract shuffling idea, where if all you're doing is shifting your purchase from a clean plant from a dirty plant that exists outside your state to a clean plant that already exists outside your state, and you're not changing the overall environmental makeup of power generation in the West, then I don't think you've accomplished anything. You've managed to have your consumers pay more for the good feeling they get from only supporting low carbon generation without any change in the overall mix. That's what we're struggling with leakage. And is it possible we just have to live with it? I don't think we're quite there yet, ready to give up on the question. We're still looking at it. And one of the things I didn't mention in our analyses, more energy efficiency investments in the capped region, especially if they're targeted, could have a real dramatic impact on the demand for drawing those imports. So maybe targeted energy efficiency would work. And that's something that will always have relevance, even if there's a national program. I think when you think of designing your program, you want something that's not going to be useless in 3 years if Congress gets around to acting. You want it to still be relevant, and that's one of the things we're struggling with the leakage question. Whatever mechanism we come up with, we want there to be a reason for it, even after Pennsylvania and Ohio and everyone else is capped.
Hi, Keith Aquat with the Capitol Fellows for the State Assembly. Is there an advantage to the executive branch spearheading this sort of cap and trade policy as opposed to the state's respective legislatures?
Separation of powers question. I don't see there's any advantage. I think there's an advantage to doing the cap and trade approach as compared to a command and control approach. I think that everyone will end up better off, right, from the sources covered, the agency that has to administer it, and the consumer that has to pay for it. I think the market-based approaches give us the ability to get more reductions for less money. And so that's why I'm mostly concerned with the environmental impacts. That's why I'm a real champion of that type of a method. I think that this is a big problem. These are just first steps we're taking. We're going to need to take bigger steps. And so we need to find ways that cost effectively reduce emissions. And whether it's the legislature or the agency that comes up with it, I don't think it matters. Although practically speaking, I don't see how the legislature can really do some of the nitty-gritty design of the program. That ultimately it does have to be passed on to the agency, and that's why they exist. While there is not a concern about CO2 hotspots with emissions trading, the existing power plants will not see air toxics reductions. Some will buy credits and not reduce emissions. Is there a place for both a cap and trade and mandatory reductions? This is from Chris Helm of CARB. He must be at his desk somewhere out there because his address is in this building. Thank you, Chris. I have a hard time really getting my head around this issue, and I know you've been debating reasons why you wouldn't do a cap and trade in the CO2 context, and I confess I just don't get it. I don't understand why you would not do trading. If you are controlling toxics right now, presumably you're doing so in a way that's protective of human health. You then have, as an overlay, the carbon cap and trade program, and I don't see how the carbon cap and trade program could play out so as to increase your toxics in a way that is not protective of human health. If you're covering toxics adequately through the toxics program, I don't see how the hotspots occur. And in fact, the carbon cap and trade may actually incentivize changes at plants that are older and less controlled because they tend to be less efficient. So I think a carbon program, because it emphasizes efficiency, is going to be a net win on toxics too. But just off the top of my head, there's smarter people than I that have been struggling with this issue. One more. Do you envision a movement to facilitate the coordination of GHG allowance trading and rec trading? Oh, great question. Frank Harris of Cox.net. I guess that's an individual. One problem with the rec markets is they're just all over the board. Every state drew up their renewable portfolio standard and created their recs market in a vacuum, and they did not coordinate with each other. And I would love to see, as a next multi-state effort, and I know some states are already working on this, better coordination of the renewable energy credit market across states. Whether they'll ever be fungible with carbon allowances, I'm not sure that makes sense because a rec bundles more than just the carbon attribute. A rec bundles NOx. It bundles all those attributes that you get from producing renewable energy from a non-emitting source. It's more than just, the value of a rec is more than just the carbon allowance. So I'm not sure you'd ever want to trade in a rec for a carbon allowance.
Hi, Mike Katz of Van Horn Consulting. In your modeling of the cap and trade program, did you see an increase of natural gas usage, and do you see that as a problem?
Great question. I'm glad you answered it, or you asked it. Can you answer it too? No. Natural gas, one of the big criticisms of carbon caps is that they're going to drive us drive us away from fuels that are more carbon intensive, or at least this is the argument, and toward more reliance on natural gas. We did not see that in our analyses. What we did see is in the business as usual analysis, we saw natural gas use in the Northeast increase. And the reason for that is was our assumptions. We assumed that we would have no pulverized new coal plants in the Northeast. I think that's a reasonable assumption. But we may see some IGCC plants. Or, if PC plants get to the point where they can carbon capture and storage, they can capture carbon and store it, then we might see some more. But my point here is that in the business as usual case, we saw an increased reliance on natural gas. With the carbon cap, we saw a less reliance on fossil fuels in general, including less natural gas needed. We saw some decrease in coal burning, which you'd probably expect because it's more carbon intensive, but we didn't see any shutdowns of existing coal plants. So we felt that the stringency of the cap was such that in this interim time period when we don't really have good control methods for coal plants, we weren't putting them out of business. They have this window of time where they can operate within a carbon cap regime while they're developing technologies to deal with that fourth P.
Hi, Chris Bush, Union of Concerned Scientists. Just wanted to talk about offsets a little bit. It seems like a conceptually elegant way to go about handling them, given some uncertainty on cost, to have these different levels that you bring in. On the international ones, are those basically then, do you accept the analytical monitoring verification rules that the CDM operates under? And then on the national America-wide offsets, it seems like by definition these are projects that are not supposed to be happening in the absence of their greenhouse gas mitigation potential and potentially large development costs in terms of bringing them online. Are you worried that there might not be a sufficient pool to bring in if you need them, or what are your rules for the national America-wide offsets, especially given Mark Trexler's report, I think it was last week, he raised some questions about the existing offsets that are coming online in the market.
Great questions. I've forgotten the first one. Oh, yeah, CDM.
Yeah.
CDM is, by virtue of the fact that we'll recognize it above $10, we have accepted the validity of those credits. And we did some research. We consulted with experts, worldwide projects experts, and we're able to get the decision makers comfortable on that. Now, whatever rules I will say, whatever rules you come up with, you're going to end up with some junk. Ours is still good. I think ours is erred on the side of being positive, but no rule is going to be perfect. So you have to, I think, structure the rules in a way that you err on the side of integrity and not on the side of being more open to more credits. Am I worried about there being a shortage? Not really. Just not. Based on the analysis I've seen, I think we're going to be fine on offsets. And I'll say that there is a lot of interest in adding other types in the interim, and it's conceivable that we'd actually add additional types before the program launches. That's possible. And the second one I can't remember.
I think you covered them all. Or just what are the rules going to be for the national America-wide?
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you raised that one. In order to get projects done in a state that's not a participating RGGI state, you need to have an agency like Cal EPA sign a memorandum of cooperation with the RGGI states saying that they will perform certain administrative functions. But once that's done, the project can originate in California or any other state that takes that on. Okay. RGGI allows for this generation of offsets from capture of methane at farms. The California Registry has a newly convened work group investigating how to implement this project-based approach. Does RGGI also keep track of N2O emissions compared to when manure is used in the absence of digesters and methane capture and use? How are the baselines determined? Please, why don't you shoot me an email and I'll get you in touch with the ag methane offset person. I can't answer this. It's too specific for my level of knowledge. Sorry. The second one, what is the predicted total dollar amount going to the public benefits programs and renewables via the 25% earmark of auctioned revenues? And is this additional to existing funds, or will it replace existing funds? From Rafael Aguilera, Environmental Defense. There is a hope that these will be in addition to existing funds, but that is up to decision makers in the individual states. And the total, in terms of the total dollar amount, it's a little bit complicated math now. In New York and Vermont, it's about $67 million allowances, so you can do the math there, and at an allowance price 2 to 5. And then in other states, it's at least 25%, so it's 25% of 70 or 25% of 100, I guess, after Massachusetts comes on. So that's 25 million times that dollar amount too, and then add them together. And that gives you the fund. And then you have to guess about whether Mass and Connecticut and New Jersey will go higher than 25. I suspect they will, but we won't know for a couple more months.
Reza Madavi, ARB staff. In your initial allocation of allowances, did you set aside a portion of allowances for the new business entry? If not, how are you going to deal with the new business entry? My second question is regarding the money for the allowances. Are you going to use portion of the money raised for the managing the market or providing liquidity into the market, or the preventing the actual volatility in the market?
As I mentioned with the auction design, I'm going to answer your second one first. We came up with principles. We'll design the auction in a way that will avoid market manipulation, be open and transparent. There's a whole set of principles in it, and I can get them to anyone who's interested. We did not, in New York, allow for money to be used for administration of the auction, but it could be implied. It's not expressly stated there. And then your first one was, and it's a great one, and I can't believe I forgot to cover this. What about new entrants? Are we worried about new entrants coming into the market? That has been a big concern, at least in terms of time spent figuring it out and how to approach, how do new sources enter this market. And we looked at existing models. In the SO2 program, the way the SO2 cap and trade program works is they have a periodic auction of a relatively small number of allowances, and new sources have access to allowances through this auction. And that's how the EPA dealt with this question with SO2. For the NOx trading programs, it was up to the state to decide. Some states did no set aside for new sources. Others, like New York, had a new source set aside. But that was in the context pre-deregulation when we were giving all the allowances away to sources. Now, given the dynamic that I described with the allowances and the deregulated market, we obviously chose to do a 100% auction. But we were comfortable with that because we felt that actually new sources are better off, because rather than in the previous scheme where they had to go and through a broker try to get allowances out of the hands of their competitors, in an auction at least, it's open and transparent. They have available allowances on a periodic basis that they can get their hands on. They're not at a disadvantage relative to existing sources. So we felt there was no unlevel playing field to level out. The auction levels the playing field out for new sources. Understanding and appreciating your desire to set the highest standard for offsets, we are concerned that only including reforestation will perversely incentivize that type of project activity above all others, especially activities that sequester substantial amounts of carbon on existing forest lands and provide a host of environmental benefits as well. This is from Emily Russell Roy of pacificforest.org. Could you explain the process that would be required to include new types of offsets, such as forest conservation and management, into the RGGI program? Sure. There is a lot of interest in both of those mentioned types of forestry offsets, especially by the states that have large tracts of managed forests. And I presume that would apply here to California, as well as New York and Maine, and less so to the other states that are involved in RGGI. These two types are on the short list in terms of what the states want to look at next for figuring out where to go from here. So I would say to just stay plugged in, because this does affect California, even the interim before you get your trading program up. I would say to the Pacific Forest Trust to keep an eye on what we're doing so we don't screw it up, and help us get through the technical issues surrounding both of those types. Is there anyone in the room who? Go ahead.
Just on the offset question again, would you you've talked about your attempt to be strict in not having fake offsets or fake reductions count as offsets. Would you be less likely to link with other states or entities if they had regulations that you view as too lax on the topic, on offsets?
I forgot to give my preface qualifier. In the RGGI process, we're all a bunch of different states, and none of us speaks for all the other states. We sort of have this rule where we speak about one another, but not for one another. So let me just say that that applies to all of my comments today. If I stated an opinion, that is probably just my own and not necessarily the opinion of all the RGGI states together. That said, what was the question?
Will the way other programs deal with offsets affect your willingness to link with them?
I would say that absolutely I would expect it to affect the thinking around linking. But, I mean, that's probably an educated guess, that if there's a system that everyone around it is saying is junk or, overly lax in terms of its standards, then I think just politically you have a hard sell to try to, who would want to link to that system? Dave West of New Jersey DEP. Hi, Dave. Say hello to Chris Sherry. If the Cal Lev CO2 waiver is not approved by US EPA, are there plans to incorporate mobile source emissions in the cap and trade program? No, there are no plans. Although, I'll just say generally, if we don't end up with that greenhouse, if we don't end up with PAVLI in force in our states, we've got to do some hard thinking about how to address transportation, because that is a big help to us, as you all know. And if it turns out we can't do it, then we have to step up efforts elsewhere and get really creative. That's the only thing I can say with that. And if there is a way to bring it into a cap and trade program, we should consider it, but I haven't heard of any good ways so far. Anybody in the room? That might do it. Thank you. Thank you.